Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Bologna, Italy, our campus in SAIS Europe. I'm delighted to be included in this important event and this really interesting and significant seminar. I'm Peter Lewis. I'm the area lead for African Studies at SAIS. And this is much better. I apologize for the interruption. We're at a different schedule here today. Today's seminar is going to be focused on can China seize Kenya's port, which really unpacks a lot of narratives and a lot of issues around China-Africa relations, around debt and diplomacy, and around the deals environment between China and African countries. Since 2014, the China-Africa Research Initiative has been conducting a long agenda of really path-breaking empirical work that's evidence-based, that's rigorous, that seeks to explore and understand and analyze the evolving relationship between China and the African continent. As we know, this relationship has accelerated, intensified, and become increasingly complex over the past 2 decades, and analysts, policymakers, and other observers have struggled to understand the changing dynamics of investment, lending, debt, trade, and other relationships between China and the African continent. And CARI has been playing an essential scholarly and analytical role in unpacking this relationship. Kenya reflects the prime issues of this research agenda. Narratives about debt diplomacy and receivership, the idea of a port grab, but the realities on the ground are very different, as our speakers will discuss. So let me just introduce the participants and then turn it over to the panel. The moderator will be Dr. Cliff Mboya, Africa editor and consultant at the China Africa Project and a research fellow at the Afro-Sino Center of International Relations. The panelists will include Professor Deborah Browdegam, who's the Bernard L. Schwartz Professor of International Political Economy and Director of the China Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Laura Duran, avocate à la Cour, Cathay Lex in Paris, France. Vijay Balaki, co-founder of Athena, Infonomics, and Yinshan Wang, MA student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. This really distinguished and broad panel will have a lot to say about all aspects of this situation, this case, this controversy. So let me finish there and turn it over to Dr. Mboya.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the introduction. And I'd like to welcome all the panelists to this event, this very important initiative. And those who are joining us from wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So we expect insights from this amazing team of researchers that have spent their time looking into these controversial projects and the narratives behind the SGR project. And as a Kenyan, this is a question that has been ringing in our minds every time it comes up. You know, the question is, why is it very secretive? What is behind the contract? That has raised a lot of speculation. Is the port under threat? What are the implications if we default? And I'm looking forward to the findings And I would like to welcome and introduce Professor Deborah Brottingham to kick us off with this very interesting presentation. So Deborah, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Cliff, for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here today. I have a PowerPoint that's going to guide the first part, but we really hope that this seminar today will be more in the lines of a conversation. So after I've done an introduction to our findings and put them in context, then Dr. Mboya will moderate a discussion amongst the panelists, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So if you have questions at any time, please put them into the Q&A, and then we will try to answer as many as we can. We won't stop the presentation to answer questions, but we'll do it during the Q&A part. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. So the Mombasa Port collateral rumor has, I think, been a mystery to many of us for a long time who've been looking at China-Africa relations. And so the context for China's engagement in Africa, I think, by and large, is related to the infrastructure gap, which is quite severe. According to the African Development Bank, the infrastructure needs across the continent are 130 to 170 billion per year, and only about half of that is currently being met. And this is in order for African countries to meet their own economic development goals and to reduce poverty, but also to meet the sustainable development goals that they've committed to. So Chinese loan commitments to Africa grew. If you look at this chart, the red is just Angola. So Angola is a really special case. We like to point out that the rest of the lending across the continent doesn't always track what's going on in Angola. So if we look just at the blue, we can see that Chinese lending essentially peaked in 2013. And this slide here excludes the Angola data, but it shows how much of the lending goes to transport. So it's over half, and some of that is going to projects like the SGR. Another 20% for power, telecoms, and other infrastructure areas. So why are the Chinese so interested in infrastructure in Africa? Well, for them, it's a win-win. It's a win-win situation because Chinese companies are getting infrastructure contracts. So they're not, all of the ones that are funded by the Chinese almost completely are tied to Chinese companies getting the work. And then they're also getting a lot of other work from other funders. So this is big. It's around 40, sometimes close over $50 billion a year in revenues from infrastructure. So when it comes to rail, the map of African rail just shows how thin it is. So, and it also shows how many different kinds of gauges there are. So the gauge is the distance between the wheels. So the rails would be on that distance, and then the carts above them would be, the cars would have wheels going on those gauges. So if you look at India, for example, it's the rails across India is quite dense. And India about fits into the area from Sudan down to Tanzania and Somalia. And you can see in the equivalent area of the continent of Africa, the rail development is very thin. If we look at Europe, we also see much denser railway connections than Africa has. And there are many advantages to rail. It's, of course, faster than going by other forms of transport. And it's also better, the safety record, it's better for the environment, it eases congestion, and there are other benefits to rail. But there are controversies too, if countries want to invest in building out their rail. Should public infrastructure pay for itself, or should it be subsidized by taxpayers? So this kind of debate goes on around the world. Should old meter gauges, if they exist, be renovated, or should new systems be built that can unify with other kinds of gauges? And should railway be built to meet future needs and to position a country to be competitive, or should it wait until the needs are already pressing, and so it's in a better position to finance it? So in 2004, the East African countries got together and they decided that they would rebuild their railways to a standard gauge. And they developed a master plan in order to do that. A group of Canadian consultants, who I believe were financed by the World Bank, did a study, and they said that the meter gauge, the old colonial railway, could meet needs up until about 2019 or possibly 2029 if the countries of East Africa invested in it. And so the question then for them was, do we invest in the old rail system, which is not going to last that much longer and won't meet the growing freight needs of the area, or build something new? So they decided to build something new. This is one of the things that happens. This is a queue of trucks waiting to cross from Kenya to Uganda by road. And the railway right now doesn't go all the way to the border. So this is a particular situation related to the pandemic, but there have been many instances in Kenyan history where there have been long queues of trucks waiting even to go from Mombasa to Nairobi. Because up until the time of the standard gauge railway, only about 5% of freight traffic in Kenya was going by rail. Whereas in Europe, it's a minimum of 10%, and in some countries, it's up to 70%. And economists consider that rail is better than trucking if the distance is over about 300 kilometers, which Nairobi is that far. So the Kenyan standard gauge railway was, there's a whole lot in our paper about how the contract was awarded without a bid and how the Chinese company went after the contract. But in many cases, the contract was awarded. The loans were signed in 2013, and in 2017, the first phase opened. And at the time it opened, this was an election year for Kenya. There was a lot of positive feeling about the railway. For passengers, it was very popular. And the president, who had put a lot of his capital into this railway and used it a lot in his election campaign, was very pleased. But that didn't last. There were many concerns raised in Kenya about the railway, the contribution of it to Kenya's debt, and how are they going to repay this. So as we can see from this slide, debt is growing. This goes all the way from 1980 to 2020. So it's nowhere near yet the way it was in the 1980s and the 1990s, up until when much of sub-Saharan Africa's debt was canceled under various initiatives. But it's been growing. And the red section here is debt to Chinese banks, whereas the other, the purple is to bonds, and others are other kinds of lenders. So debt has been growing, and certainly in the pandemic era, it's much more of a concern because African countries' resiliency has been challenged by the pandemic. And growth rates also have been going down. If we look at 2013 across the continent, it was still fairly high, about 5%. And in Kenya, at that point when the railway loans were being signed, Kenya was being called one of the lions of Africa. It was growing at over 6%, and it looked quite robust prospects. So Chinese loan commitments just quickly, they started to go down when African growth rates started to go down. And they've been going down for a while. This is excluding Angola. So the debt trap diplomacy rumors start to arise in 2018, and they're related to the Mombasa Port, what happened in Mombasa Port. And these fears grew in Kenya. So just briefly, the New York Times, along with others, developed a narrative that China had deliberately created this debt trap in Sri Lanka and then seized Hambantota Port when the Sri Lankans couldn't pay for the loan. Of course, it's much more complicated than that. But that was the narrative that was out there. And it was essentially unchallenged, I think, for almost a year. And so this spread to Kenya as well. Moody's was warning that based on the Sri Lanka experience that Kenya assets risk seizure. So this narrative and this fear was out there. Now, just briefly, give a reference to work that I've done with Meg Rithmeyer looking into the Hambantota Port case. And our work points out to a number of different errors that the New York Times team did when they were conducting their research. And we show a much more complicated case that was not at all an asset seizure. And if you want that, you can read the Atlantic piece. We could go into it in the Q&A. But in Kenya, so this, as this debt trap diplomacy rumor is floating around the world, people were getting more concerned. But the Kenyan officials were saying that the SGR will pay for itself. So they were creating this alternative idea that this is a really strong investment that is not going to be a debt trap, and Kenyans shouldn't worry about it. And then in December, John Githongo, who's a well-known civil society activist in Kenya, tweeted out 3 pages of a letter from the Auditor General's office, which was doing an audit of Kenya Ports Authority. And so I and many other people looked at this. It's still out there on Twitter. And it was a very perplexing letter. It was full of technical language. It was very difficult to understand. But John Githongo summarized it saying, Kenya's port is collateral for the Chinese loan. And when we did the research, which I'll briefly tell you about, we realized that the Auditor General really did believe this. He was worried that Kenya's port was collateral for the loan, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So the letter was a management letter, which is an overview letter. So the audit itself was still in draft form, and what the management letter does is sends it to the company that's being audited, in this case, Kenya Ports Authority, and asks them some questions, asks them to clarify some things. So this was still all in draft. Nothing had been finalized. But even in the final report, there were questions raised. So this was the part, and I won't go through all of this, but in the second paragraph here, it says the China Eximbank would become a principal in over KPA if KRC, which is Kenya Railway Corporation, defaults in its obligations, and China Eximbank exercised power over the escrow account security. So I read this and I thought, I have no idea what this says. I don't know what these terms are. This is all, and so this became my own effort to try to figure out what did this mean. And so I started out by working with another lawyer, Juan Kadani, and we looked into, he basically trained me on some of these things, but it was really a new language. Escrow accounts, waivers of sovereign immunity, take or pay agreements, off-take agreements, contingent liability. I had a lot of development economics training, and I knew about internal rates of return and net present value and all these aspects of projects, but I didn't know about the legal side. And so it was, after working with Juan, the second thing I did was to buy a book. So I started trying to train myself in the law and business of international project finance. But this was also really tough. And I realized that I really needed about 3 years of schooling. But what I did instead was to put a team together. And so this is where Vijay Balaki and Laura Daron came in. And so what we did from the beginning is we used this case and we taught it to students. We did several workshops on it, and we tried to work through what is going on. We tried to find other pieces. And then once we had done those workshops with students, we then we dug into it more deeply through a methodology that I've been calling forensic internet investigation, which is basically closely combing through the different companies that are involved, looking through their websites, looking through all the parliament websites, trying to get all the primary documents, and then being in touch with Kenyans, some of whom shared some of the contracts with us. And so we were able to basically do what Laura pushed for, which is we created a map of this project. And what I learned was that these projects, these very complex projects, and at this point in the first phase, we're talking about $3.6, $3.8 billion in loans. These become very complex projects. And I remember Law saying that in a normal one that would be done in Europe, there would be over 1,000 pages of different legal contracts and documents that would be all assembled as part of this big project. And so she said, we need to map this out, the different pieces that we know are part of this project, and see how they relate to each other. And that way we can figure out what's going on with the port. So Vijay and Laura together developed this amazing map, which has all the different parts in it. And I'm not going to walk through all of this right now. They're really the ones to do that if you have specific questions. But when we looked at this, this enabled us to see who the different stakeholders were, what their contractual relationships were, and where the money was going, so where the payment flows were going. And that helped us make sense of a lot of the terms that the Auditor General had used, both in the management letter and then later in the audit reports. So it was clear that the Auditor General, when we read what he had said, even after the draft was finalized and later published, and we had access to that, the Auditor General did believe that Kenya Ports Authority was a borrower of the Chinese loans. and that Kenya Ports Authority had not disclosed this. So the auditor said, you should disclose this because it's a risk. If you're a borrower, then there's a risk that if the loan isn't paid, that you will have obligations. Kenya Ports Authority had also signed a sovereign immunity waiver, and I'll talk about that very briefly. And therefore, the Auditor General said, Kenya Port Authority's assets are exposed to risk of takeover by the lender. And he said, Kenya Port Authority's revenue and assets have expressly guaranteed the repayment of the loan. So this is all what the Auditor General said, and he did believe this. But what we found out by going through this with a fine-tooth comb is that that wasn't actually the case. So our key findings, and I'll talk about them very briefly here. The first is that Kenya Ports Authority is not a borrower. And if you have trouble following me on this, I understand completely. I didn't do 3 years, but I did nearly 2 years of trying to learn about these terms. So let me see if I can walk you through this a little bit. So the Auditor General quoted a lot of the different pieces of the various contracts in his report. And so we have some of the actual language from the contracts. So what we found is that the Auditor General misread a really key clause. This clause is 17.5 in the four-party payment arrangement. So let me go back to this. The four-party payment arrangement links up Kenya Port Authority, Kenya Railway Corporation, the National Treasury, and the Eximbank. So they all have some responsibility for the repayment of the loans. But as we found out, Kenya Ports Authority responsibility was very limited, and it was through a relationship that it had with Kenya Railway Corporation, not directly with the China Eximbank. So we'll go back to this. So the Auditor General wrote, talking about clause 17.5, he said, the agreement in clause 17.5 refers to Kenya Ports Authority as a borrower. So he said, okay, they're a borrower, and they haven't admitted this. And then he wrote, under this clause, the agreement provides that each of the borrowers, and he said Kenya Railways Corporation and Kenya Ports Authority agrees. So he's saying that both of them are borrowers. And I remember the moment when we found out that this wasn't true. We had Law, who's our international lawyer who's worked on many commercial deals. And she looked at this clause 17.5 of the agreement, and she said, look, this is talking about 3 different entities. It's talking about the borrower. And she said, it's capitalized. And in the start of the loan contract, they have this definition section. And all of the different stakeholders, the different actors are defined. So the borrower is defined at the beginning. And it's always used then afterwards, and they always capitalize it. And she said, this is talking about 3 different entities. The borrower, which we had already determined that Kenya National Treasury had signed the loans, which is why it was perplexing that the Auditor General kept saying that Kenya Ports Authority was a borrower, because it really looked from everything else we had seen as though it was a regular government-to-government loan, and Kenya's National Treasury was the borrower. And this actually clinched it, because what that clause says, each of the borrower, KRC and KPA agrees. So there are actually 3 entities, the borrower, KRC, and KPA, and each of them agrees to do something. And so when we found that, we realized that the Auditor General had misrepresented or misunderstood the status of KPA. And the second key finding was that the port assets were not collateral. We found through the reconstruction of these contracts and the relationships that KPA was linked to the railway project as its major customer, not as its collateral. And it was through signing a take or pay agreement. And this is where we get into these complicated phrases. But what I learned is that a take or pay agreement is a kind of a gold standard element in international project finance. And it's put together, like take an electricity project. If someone's financing an electricity project, they want to make sure that there's a buyer for the electricity. So the government, if they're trying to borrow this money to build an electricity project, they will make sure that the electricity has a buyer. Usually that would be a utility of some kind. And they sign a contract to take all the service or the electricity produced by the new, say it's a hydropower plant. And if they don't take all of that electricity, they still agree to pay. So there's kind of a guaranteed market. And so this take or pay agreement was between Kenya Ports Authority, which is transferring freight from the port onto the rail and then to its inland container depot, which it has several of them, but the main one is near Nairobi. And so Kenya Ports Authority actually owns these inland ports, and it transfers the freight on the trains to those inland ports that it also owns. So it's essentially taking a service from Kenya Railway Corporation. And so they agree to either ship a certain amount of freight every year or pay Kenya Railway Corporation the difference. So that's a take or pay agreement. And it helps ensure revenues to repay the loan, but loan repayment is still the responsibility of the National Treasury. And so this, again, this is very complicated stuff. It was so interesting to learn all of it, but I can understand if this is like getting down too much in the weeds. So we'll just say that we charted all this out here and we can come back to it. But the other element that was really complex, but actually quite simple in reality, is the waiver of sovereign immunity. So I'll try to walk you through that here, and Laura can do this a lot better than I can, but she can elaborate on this in the Q&A. So I was having dinner last night with a friend of mine who teaches at the London School of Economics, and I asked him, have you ever heard of a waiver of sovereign immunity? And he's been teaching there for decades. And he said, no. So he's been involved in teaching about international trade and about international finance, but he'd never heard of this. And I never had either. But it turns out this is absolutely standard to have in an international loan contract of commercial nature. And why is that? Well, it turns out that governments are sovereign under international law. So under international law, a bank cannot sue a government of another country and compel them to appear in court. So if you're in New York and you're a New York bank and a government, and there's a dispute over a loan contract, you can't sue them or compel them to come for arbitration. So that they have sovereign immunity from another country's jurisdiction. And the second element of sovereign immunity is that for enforcement. So even if they if they didn't come and they forfeited in some kind of trial somewhere, they also have sovereign immunity from enforcement. So if, say, a judge says, okay, you've got to pay this, and then the bank says, we want you to pay, they actually are immune from that enforcement on their territory. But then you're not going to get an international bank to loan you money if there's no way that they have any legal way to arbitrate or go to court to get their money back if you refuse to pay. And so this sovereign immunity waiver, and I have an example of one up there, it says that the country, the borrower, agrees that if there are legal proceedings, that it will allow the proceedings to go to court. And also, if there is a judgment against it, it will allow that judgment to be enforced. So leaving out the sovereign immunity waiver, I learned from a colleague who is teaching also at SAIS and who is with a big Norton Rose, I think it is, a big law firm here in Washington, which is all over the world. He said, if you left that out of a commercial loan contract, this would be grounds for professional malpractice. I thought that was pretty stunning. And then we looked at a bunch of contracts that our colleagues over at Aid Data had posted. And they all of these contracts, nearly all of them from other commercial banks from other countries and export credit agencies, contained that sovereign immunity waiver. And I have one up here from Belgium. The borrower undertakes not to claim immunity from jurisdiction or enforcement for itself or its assets. So it's a very standard thing. But it can look quite alarming if this is something you've never seen before. And we've seen that in a number of cases. So getting to conclude here, why Mombasa Port is not collateral. The Auditor General misread the contract involving KPA, Kenya Ports Authority. Kenya Ports Authority is not a borrower. And Kenya Ports Authority, their only duty is to take the standard gauge railway service, i.e. ship freight on the train, or pay the shortfall to Kenya Railway Corporation via an escrow account. So the sovereign immunity waiver is required to allow disputes among all parties to be resolved. And that's why all of the parties, Kenya Railway Corporation, Kenya Ports Authority, and the National Treasury all signed it because they're all parties to different contracts in this overall package. And if they were not, if they didn't sign it, they perhaps couldn't be compelled to answer if there were disputes later on. So we also looked into areas about the this project related to debt distress through a cash flow analysis. And we found that the railway revenues are not going to be able to repay the loan, which is what others have also shown in different analyses. They can cover the operating costs, but they won't be able to repay the loans. So the loan repayments will mainly come from another part of the whole contract arrangement, which was a railway development levy. It's a 2% tax now on Kenyan imports, and that creates a pool of money that is dedicated to railway development, and that should be repaying the loan. We also found that Kenya Ports Authority can comfortably manage its take-or-pay commitments under the project. At the moment, the standard gauge railway Phase 1 and Phase 2A accounts for about 7% of Kenya's public debt, or about 12% of its external public and publicly guaranteed debt. And 2022 is an election year in Kenya, and this is the peak repayment period, the peak repayment year. So this is all creating to the new challenges that Kenya has. But what Kenyans should not be worried about is that the China Eximbank is going to seize Mombasa Port, or indeed any port anywhere in the world. We do recommend that Kenya should release these contracts. The contracts should have a clause in them. They usually have a confidentiality clause, but the confidentiality clause has a section that says if local law requires the contracts to be released, they should be released. And it looks as though there's a good case for that in Kenya's constitution. And then we also did an analysis of extending the repayment periods by 10 years, which China Eximbank has done in other cases. And this would ease pressure on Kenya's balance of payments. So I'm going to stop now and turn it back to our moderator, Dr. Mboya. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Deborah. I think that was very insightful, and as a Kenyan, this is very satisfying and relieving to a large extent, because this is a question that has been there for such a long time. You know, it's a question that has gone unanswered for a very long time. You know, my only concern is considering how persistent the debt narrative has been for some time, despite evidence to the contrary. I'm just hoping that this would be taken seriously and followed up, and this information actually doesn't confine itself to academics and those in the China-Africa space. I think it is a very important information and insight that should go out to the general public, particularly journalists who have been who have played a key role in not necessarily misinformation, but actually misinterpreting the kind of contracts that exist between China and African governments. And I don't blame them, because much of this is attributed to the secrecy, you know, and the confidentiality clauses that are there, which I personally think sometimes are unnecessary. But then before I go to the first question that I had regarding that, I just want to briefly go through what you've said and just be clear on the key takeaways and what we should learn from this research and your findings. So it is very clear that going back to the newspaper report that was published, there was a clear misinterpretation of some of these economic terms, you know, waiver of sovereignty. And this persists, you know. This persists not just in Kenya. You know, we have the Entebbe case, we have the Sri Lanka case, and just today, there are reports that Sri Lanka is not able to pay debt, which still goes back to strengthen the debt trap narrative. But having said that, I think the key question that comes to mind after this presentation is issues to do with maybe credibility of this research, because an instance happened, because the same leaked report that you accessed, the same report that some investigative journalists in Kenya accessed, and they used that to justify the claim that the the Mombasa port is under threat of seizure. So it brings out issue of credibility, because there were concerns that we have tried to publish this in the local press so that this information comes out. And the problem with the China-Africa space, sometimes when you come up with the information that suits the Chinese narrative, then you're seen to be taking the Chinese side or defending Chinese interests. But this is research work that a lot of analysis has gone into it. So you've responded to a bit of this question by talking about the methodology and your forensic internet investigation. The question was, to what extent, what kind of information did you actually access in the contract? Because a lot of reporters have been trying very hard to get to the contract and the details there. And, the narrative out here, it is secret, and very few people, apart from maybe the head of state and a few insiders, are privy to the details in the contract. So you've mentioned that, but I just want you to elaborate a bit, in what form, quantity are your sources credible? Because we want to dispel the concern that this may be in defense of Chinese interests. So what specific documents, information did you get, and what do they actually reveal in terms of African policymakers when they sit with Chinese policymakers to negotiate and sign these deals? What does it say about that, apart from the fact that the port of Mombasa is not collateral? I hope I was too wordy with that, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to ask. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Mboya, for those questions. I'm going to ask Laure and Vijay to come in on this, but I'll say first of all that the only complete contract that we have is the take-or-pay agreement, which is the contract between, it's a wholly Kenyan contract, and it's operates under Kenyan law, and it's an agreement between Kenya Ports Authority and Kenya Railway Corporation. But what we have for the other contracts is pieces of them that have been released. And for example, one of the reporters for The Nation did see the loan contract and reports that there's no mention of Mombasa Port as collateral, but then reaffirms the collateral rumor by pointing to the sovereign immunity waiver, which says that all of Kenya's assets are basically up for grabs. That was his interpretation, because clearly he didn't understand what the sovereign immunity waiver actually means. And so he interpreted it as still holding that the port was still collateral, which was the same interpretation that the Auditor General had made. So I'm going to ask Laure and Vijay, we had these different pieces, and then basically what we did is we relied on the experience that Vijay and Laura had in putting these kinds of contracts together and these kinds of packages together in order to unpack the information that we did have. And one of the key sources was the audit report as well, which is a document that he also had access to a number of the contracts, although not the loan contract. So Laura, could you come in and then Vijay to comment on how we ended up reconstructing this set of contracts?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Hi, Deborah. I think the key thing is, as Deborah just mentioned, we had access to very few sources, and so we relied on simply confronting the different bits of information that we had to see whether the interpretation that was put forward added up, or whether just by reading the original material, we actually arrived at different conclusions. So I think this was very well captured in the set of slides that Deborah has just presented. We simply confronted what was in the Auditor General's letter against what was in the contract to see whether it supported the interpretation or the statement made by the Auditor General. And we relied on our professional training and experience in getting the understanding right. So contrary to what the Auditor General had understood, there is nothing in the contract to say that KPR is actually a borrower, and the sentence actually was drafted towards a different purpose. So that's the work we did. Again, I think one thing I want to clarify here is that the map that we did, against this is a very focused small part of a big project. There is nothing there about the constructions agreement. There is nothing there about the operational agreements. This is just a map that we recreated to understand how the revenues for the reimbursement of the loan flow, and to which extent each of the parties that were put in questions were asked to be a direct or indirect contributors to the reimbursement of the loan. So these projects are extremely complex. The number of pages of legal contracts range in the thousands rather than, you know, the tens. But we started from asking ourselves, where does this rumor come from? And can we see anything out of the very limited available material that actually supports the interpretation behind the rumor? And from the very little material that was available to us, we already were able to reach the conclusion that there was nothing here to support this rumor. So somebody somewhere had misinterpreted the material that we had. One other thing that maybe I would like to underline, and this is to a point that you made, Dr. Mboya, is about the confidentiality and the fact that these agreements are confidential in nature. So as a practitioner of these project finance deals, one thing I want to underline is that confidentiality for these agreements is nothing out of the usual standards. That's actually good professional practice. Reason being that these agreements are commercial in nature, and so it has long been agreed that when state agencies venture into the market of commercial actors, they behave like regular private commercial actors, and so they must enjoy the same degree of confidentiality for the sake of being able to negotiate and conclude transactions with some degree of serenity and in business conditions. If they were to negotiate these transactions under the public eye, there is no way that they would be able to reach the same commercial conditions as their private counterparts. So the fact that there are confidentiality clauses protecting these agreements is not some indication of a conspiracy or something nefarious at work. That's actually just actors behaving like people do behave in the private market. There are, as Dr. Branigan underlined, there are some rules under which the law in certain territories will compel the governments to release these agreements to public scrutiny after they've been concluded, or sometimes during the tendering process. But again, just the fact that there is confidentiality doesn't necessarily point to something abnormal going on. And I think this is something important to understand also for the general public.
Anyone else will want to weigh in? Deborah, Jishwan?
Yeah, I could go in now. Thanks, Laure, for sort of setting that segue for me. From where Laure is coming in, which is sort of the legal work that we had an opportunity to evaluate, versus all the other project-related, financial, commercial, and economic information that was available. I must say that though what was probably publicly available was limited, it was definitely quite extensive in the sense that we were able to get information from the Auditor General's office, of course, publicly put up. We were able to get information from the Kenya Port Authority, their audit reports, from Kenya Revenue Authority, of course, how to interpret, for example, how the levy is structured, administered, collected. Kenya Railway Corporation, their books and their financial reports. So we attempted our very best to go out and collect every piece of evidence that is probably publicly available, and try to stitch this narrative on top of that material, right? Because there are already quite a few interpretations that are flying around in the media. And we wanted to give each of that interpretation a serious sort of review. So we started with the questions that we read out there. We went back into the documents that we were able to access, including the take-or-pay agreement, including the, for example, on the escrow arrangement, obviously there was no direct evidence that we could discern out of the material that we had access to. So we went out and saw, where such similar escrow arrangements were structured by China, and we found that there was something very similar happening in the Entebbe Airport case. So we sort of went in, figured out, how that works, because we had access to the loan agreements in the Entebbe Airport financing deal. So we've tried to learn, the Chinese sort of lending practices and the way they go about structuring some of these, relationships and transactions by reviewing some of that other relatable material that's out there in public. So we gathered all of this information. We used these sort of, questions that were out there. And we tried to empirically deduce what we learned from that information. Another interesting piece out there is, there is obviously no extensive feasibility that was done. There was one feasibility report that's out there by, I think, the China Bridge Corporation, which was done many years ago. It did provide some economic foundation to understand where they're kind of going with this project. But of course, it's not like your typical detailed feasibility report that you would commission before taking up a project, right? So we did learn a little bit from that. And when we constructed a proxy financial model, in fact, we actually built a proxy financial model to understand, what are the underpinning financial, incentives for different parties, and what are the underpinning risk allocation issues, and that's how we deduced that the dependence on passenger revenues and freight revenues is tiny for this project. This project is basically financed out of public support coming in from the levy, right? So yeah, I mean, the sources are all mostly public. Some, of course, consultations, but very extensive, body of evidence that we managed to compile through these several months of effort.
Well, anyone else, or I move to the next question? Okay, so I think that is clear enough. The evidence is clear, and the document is out there, so it's very easy for someone just to go back and follow up with the process and see how you arrived at the findings. But then I want to answer another question that will be key, particularly for the Kenyan public, and especially during this very tense political period when China keeps coming up. And now that this report is out, it claims that for sure the port of Mombasa is not cannot be seized. It is not up for grabs. It's not part of collateral. And the next question then becomes, if not the port, then what? And I'll put this in the context of the debt trap myth, because this is not particular to the Kenyan case. It happens all over. You go to Uganda, to Sri Lanka, it is the same case all over. And I was just wondering, is this a trend that we see in all the commercial projects being done by Chinese lenders and other governments, or is it uniform, or do we have some form of specificity when it comes to this country? So in the Kenyan case, if not the Mombasa Port, then what is collateral? There's a sense that if we are not able to pay, the Chinese officials have said we could always renegotiate. We do it in a friendly manner. But then what if we can't completely pay, or we have a dispute and we don't agree with the arbitration that happens in Beijing? Because some lawyers have said that's where we got hooked, because at the end of the day they decide. So what if they decide, okay, now we are going, it's not in the contract, but if we go to arbitration and they say now you have to take some of your assets, how will that play out? So if not the port, what is at stake? Anyone?
Let me just start that, and then I'm going to turn it over to Law. But this is something that, it's a very good question, Cliff, and this is something that a lot of countries are wondering, what does it mean now if we default? Because it looks like Sri Lanka they never did default in the past on their Hamad loans, but they've defaulted, or they're not calling it a default yet, but they're putting a pause on all of their payments right now. So this gets down to what is, how do these arbitration things actually work, and what actually happens. And I'll just give one quote before I turn it over to Laura, which is a quote from, it's a paper that Anna Gelper and others did. And they said that it's very difficult, essentially, to get a sovereign government to actually collect on them. And so most of these cases don't actually go to court, because they get settled in through discussions before it ever goes to court. So Laura, why don't you weigh in on that from your experience?
Sure, thank you. So the short sentence is that if not the ports, then what is we restructure the debt. And that's how it always consistently works in practice. And there's a number of technical reasons for that. First of all, again, you have to remember that even though there's the general temptation to picture things as this is all Kenya, in actual facts, governmental agencies, they work in very linear ways. So the port belongs to the Kenya Port Authority, which is not a borrower. So if the National Treasury was to default on the loan, it doesn't follow that the National Treasury can just go and decide one-sidedly, I'll just take the port and offer it as a collateral. These are different agencies, and there are some legal mechanisms in place to protect it. It would be a little bit like if you were to default on a debt, you wouldn't be able to go to your neighbors and say, I'll just put your houses up collateral. It doesn't work like that. So the borrower is really the National Treasury, and if there is a default, it's the default of the National Treasury. So it's up to the National Treasury to sit down with China and have a conversation about restructuring. But the Kenya Port Authority and their assets are actually protected from any decision by the National Treasury. It's not something that they just can go and pick up like a family drawer to offer as collateral. So whenever there is an overborrowing, or it's just impossible because of hardship economic conditions out there to make good on the payments, there is always a sit-down moment where you restructure the loan, because it isn't in any of the parties' interests for a party to actually default on their payments. It's always better to prolong, and there are a number of international, quite high-profile cases out there, Sri Lanka being one of those. When you see that payments are going to come to a shortfall, then there's a sit down to restructure, to make the level of indebtedness more supportable, more accessible for repayment to the borrower. Arbitration as a last resort, again, is not a very efficient way. It's there because there has to be a dispute resolution mechanism. But it's important to keep in mind that going to arbitration and getting a nice award giving you some rights is only halfway to the solution, because once you have the award, you need to enforce it. And enforcement is really the problematic part when it comes to sovereign governments, because I mean, I don't think it takes a very good effort to very big imagination effort to just picture what if the Chinese government were to come to Kenya saying, I've got this nice Chinese award telling me that I can use your port. What do you think the Kenyan reaction would be to this? It would probably be, well, nice and well, we hope that you're happy with your China's decision, but it bears no legal consequences in this jurisdiction. Because for your arbitration award obtained in China to actually have a legal effect in Kenya, we as a sovereign government would need to pass it through our court system to grant you the rights to enforce it here in Kenya. And, you know, there's very little chance that a Kenyan judge would actually defer to such an award. So again, with the knowledge that seeking a direct enforcement of the clause is probably a direct road to failure, most of the parties in those circumstances would elect to sit down and attempt to restructure the debt.
Well, I'm very glad you mentioned the issue to do with the enforcement and the challenges that come with it. And it reminds me of the day when the Court of Appeal in Kenya ruled that actually the SGR contract was illegal in its entirety because of single sourcing and, you know, things to do with procurement laws and things like that. And the then chair of the Law Society of Kenya actually mentioned that actually the Chinese are being set up in a way that if Kenya defaults, then we could use that to justify the fact that they're not able to seize the port. And it makes sense because, you know, you could have the port, but then, you know, there are legal provisions that protect things like that from happening. And that could be another evidence just to show how difficult it is to actually come and seize such a massive asset in case of default. So I'm very glad you mentioned that.
If I can just add something also to this, I think what is important to picture is that the borrower we've established is the National Treasury. The lender is the Eximbank, and the Eximbank is a bank. So it's a banking establishment whose trade it is to lend money and then profit via the collection of interests on this lending. So picture yourself in a situation where the Eximbank would actually be given the opportunity, the very hypothetical opportunity to seize the port. I'm still not clear what the Eximbank would actually do with the port, because they're not in the business of exploiting, you know, operating a port infrastructure. So from the point of view of the lender, what you're really after is trying to get your money back. And for that, the best way is still to sit down and have a financial conversation with the National Treasury. It's not to seize assets that you'd be quite unable to operate, even if you had the desire to do so.
Well, thanks for that. And before I go to the questions from our participants, something just came to mind, and I'll quickly ask, what is the role of insurance or security, like not security, but insurance, because I understand the contract was actually insured in China. So what is the role of that, and how does it affect the whole deal when it comes to maybe paying back and when you have challenges to pay? Any insights on that?
Yeah, so that's a really complicated question, because the thing is, there are some general rules to these projects. However, not one project is entirely similar to another project. So to give you a really reliable, precise answer, there's only one way, which is to look at the entire contractual documentation to understand the interrelation between the contracts and see how they work on each other. Unfortunately, we're back to the confidentiality issue and the fact that only a very limited percentage of this entire transactional picture is actually available for review. Having said that, so insurance companies can give you insurance against certain defaults. Of course, they take securities as well. I don't have any precise knowledge, to be honest with you, on the insurance participation in this precise project. But just on the basis, I think that the point to underline is this: just on the basis of the loan documentation that we reviewed, again, the port is not really at stake. And to answer one of the questions, if I can, that I've seen in the questions and answer session, where somebody's asking, well, what if the Chinese government were to sit down and agree on offering the port as a collateral? I think this is a very hypothetical question, if I may, because, in theory, everything is possible. In theory, what's to stop the government of Kenya from just auctioning out the port for 1 RMB to the Chinese government? But the thing is, there are rules to what governments can do. And I don't know that it is in the jurisdiction of government to just have a private conversation with a Chinese authority and say, well, why don't you take our ports? Without knowledge of the Kenyan law, I'm pretty sure that this would be unconstitutional. And as you've just said, even the entire validity of the contract, because of some mishaps through the tendering process, would be questionable under Kenyan law.
Just to add on the question of insurance, we know that in this project, SAIS-CARI insured the project, the Chinese insurance company, SAIS-CARI. And I think they have a 6% one-time fee upfront on the project that they charged to insure the project, which, in general international project finance context is a high rate. But I would want to qualify that saying we don't know what the insurance agreement exactly is. What kind of risks are they covering? Are they covering, risks from technical failure, risks from kind of environmental and other kinds of natural disasters? We don't know whether political risk is covered that is offered to lenders and to stakeholders of this project. So we don't know what's the basket of risks that this insurance contract is covering, but we do know that they're charging the 6% one-time fee, for the project, right? And typically, when you look at insurance is either covering your, top line or your bottom line, right? So there is obviously some kind of a revenue linked cover or a margin linked cover. In this case, it's probably a revenue linked cover that SAIS-CARI is. So definitely to that extent, some of the intrinsic financial risks of this project are hedged because there is an insurance package that's available. But if for some reason Kenya defaults, and that default is because of circumstances that are not necessarily covered under this insurance contract, then obviously lenders will have rights to go into settlement for in whichever way that the parties might decide to execute that settlement.
Well, thanks for your responses. So I'll go to the questions that we have in the Q&A, and I'm trying to keep this as relevant as possible to the topic, but then at some point we are bound to go beyond the scope on related issues, So this is, let me see. I'll direct this to Professor Brottingham because she's spoken quite extensively on the issue of the narratives. And one asks, how come such wrong narratives have spread for so many years? And has China reacted to these allegations to deny it? I'll say for the Kenyan case, yes, there's been a response, and Chinese officials say they looked at the contract and it's not true that the port is part of collateral. Our Minister of Finance, our Minister of Transport, our Minister of Information, they have all denied this fact. So Chinese officials have responded, but then the question to Professor is, how come such narratives have persisted for so long? Professor?
I think it's because these are complex. So for example, in the Hambantota Port case, if you don't read the research that Meg Rithmeyer and Umesh Morodumale and others and I have done on that, which are all, it's easy to say debt trap diplomacy and to say the Chinese are setting debt traps around, and then boom. But explaining how these complex deals work and what happens if a deal doesn't work as well as it's supposed to, it takes a lot of time and takes a lot of research to do it. It took us, Vijay mentioned 7 months. That's how long he's been working on this. But we've been working, the rest of our team, we've been working on this for nearly 2 years. So it's also, Laura can speak to this, and maybe we don't have time to go into this, but like the Montenegro case, where this is, it becomes very useful politically to wave this idea around that there's some kind of collateral and that there's a nefarious arrangement that a government has made with the Chinese, and it becomes useful politically. But I think basically it becomes old news. Like, I don't know if anyone's even going to cover our report, any of the media, because this is news back from 2018. And now that we're saying it wasn't correct, it's not news anymore.
Yeah, if I can just add something to this, I think it's important to understand that, as mentioned, first of all, these are really complex agreements. So the language around it is complex, and it does take time to explain what is a waiver of sovereign immunity, whether something is or isn't a collateral. So it's important to understand that there is no simple answer to explaining why it's not a collateral, and unless you're willing to put in the time to listen and the time to research, then you are going to walk away from this conversation with your initial impression, because you just haven't been paying attention long enough to understand why it's not the case. So that's one thing, and unfortunately we live in a world where journalists have very limited windows of attention to dedicate to one particular subject before they move on to the next subject. So there's a general level of confusion in there. I think it's also important to understand that there's an economic difference between being a collateral and being part of an economic construction where all the involved parties bear a certain part of the economic risk. In the case of the Kenya port, it's not true that they're a collateral for the National Treasury's debt. It is true, however, that they have a role in this project by providing a line of regular revenues and financing to enable the reimbursement of the loan. And yes, there is a risk that the purchase of services that they're willing to take through the take or pay might not be economically profitable, but that is a normal part of risk bearing from an economic entity, and the Kenya Port Authority is primarily an economic entity in the business of operating a port infrastructure. So some degree of exposure to the Kenya Port Authority in this project is normal by reason of there being an economic entity. It doesn't add up to their being put up there as collateral, as a victim for some very reckless borrowing that the National Treasury would have done from the Chinese Eximbank.
Cliff, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was saying that is quite interesting, and I say the questions are going a bit beyond the scope, but I think they are still very relevant. to this discussion. So I'll just go ahead and ask, because I know this is a topic that you've handled for quite some time, not just the Kenyan case, and it will also help enrich our understanding of the SGR case. So Jonathan Lewis asked if we could describe the rationale from a Chinese perspective on this African infrastructure spending, and he asks if there's any economic rationale that will support the narrative of debt diplomacy. And I thought this is important because even as the narrative persists, we know it is a fact that some countries are actually struggling to pay, not necessarily because of Chinese debt, but because, debt is becoming a problem, and maybe COVID has a role to play with that, but then it is an issue that we must be alive to. So what is the Chinese perspective on this issue? Anyone?
Anybody want to take that?
I mean, I could kind of go at it, take that question briefly. So I think in international project finance, whether you take traditional Western supported development financial institutions, or now increasingly Asian countries supported DFIs, the fundamental relationship between an investor and a contractor is pretty similar. So if you do a quick ballpark assessment, I mean, historically speaking, not probably just today, but if you look at the historical data of loans made by, World Bank and the World Bank Group, likewise, OPIC, which is the Overseas Investment Promotion Corporation of United States, erstwhile, which is now USDFC, or you take, similar such institutions in other countries. By and large, there is a clear motivation to support home country contractors to undertake new economic and new business opportunities in the investee markets, right? And of course, that narrative is very different in case of a multilateral institution, because in multilateral institutions, there are multiple investors, multiple stakeholders. But still, the biggest investor, the biggest stakeholder will get to have a say. So I think fundamentally here, the opportunity that China is trying to create for its own, infrastructure contractor community is to provide more market avenues, whether it is in Asia or in Africa. So fundamentally, I think that would be the commercial or economic reason. And if there are any aligned geopolitical reasons, those probably would come along the way. But unless there is a fundamental commercial or economic reason to do this, because these are risky investments, for any country to sort of commit $3 or $4 billion of loan into a market where such projects have never been carried out at that scale, with very little investor or kind of return recovery precedents, these are big, risky bets. So I don't think any country would be keen on taking these kind of risky bets unless there is a fundamental commercial or economic interest. And then there could be secondary geopolitical interests. But I would say the primary focus is to create new markets for their contractors and suppliers.
Yeah, and I agree with you totally. I think it is not a secret that China has this excess capital, excess capacity in terms of technology, manpower, and it's good business just investing this abroad. And we also know that infrastructure, we have a huge deficit that is needed. So it looks like a win-win situation for all of us. The difference is just that maybe the Chinese and the Western look at the way it is done in different ways, and there are also political reasons. It comes with political influence. It's it creates employment opportunities for Chinese companies and some of their engineers and workers. So it makes economic and political sense to do that. And other countries also do it. It's just that maybe Chinese people do it in a different way. So I totally agree with you. And the next questions comes from a good friend of mine. She's been working on the SGR project for some time and interviews, and I think she's doing a good job. And Karen asks, to what extent is this document tracing exercise and lender mapping in the process of conducting this case study? And she asks, is it transferable for studying other Chinese finance infrastructure projects? Are there certain procedures that may be standardized? Because I'm sure those guys looking at Chinese lending generally will want to take this and try to apply it in other cases. So do you think these procedures are maybe standardized and applied in other contexts? Anyone?
Let me address that, and then we're going to have to wind up, so we'll hand it over to Peter Lewis after this. But I think, Karen, that it's, for me to retrace this, I really couldn't have done this work without Laura and Vijay. It was every step of the way they were holding our hands, and it was like having private tutorials, and we just appreciate this from both of you. And I remember at one point when I asked Vijay, I said, look at that contract about the Eximbank would be a principal in over KPA. What does this mean? And he looked at me and he said, this is just mumbo jumbo. It doesn't mean anything. So I thought we need to translate this, from accounting language into English. And he said, they don't seem to know what they're talking about. I would never have been able to do that on my own. So very much appreciate it. We hope you read our paper. And thank you to all the panelists. Let me turn it over to Peter Lewis to say the final words. And thank you to our attendees.
Thank you, Professor Bradigan, and thanks to all of the panelists for just a superb exchange and a superb presentation. You've really revealed layers of legal, financial, contractual, and political elements in this puzzle, which underlies an overly simple narrative, as we so often find in these circumstances. And so a lot of hard work by a great team and a lot of care and rigor has gone into this, a hallmark of the China Africa Research Initiative's efforts, and we've been delighted to welcome everybody into the joint meeting on Zoom. And we've been really privileged to co-sponsor with CARI. So thanks so much and have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Have a good time.
Bye, everyone.